The driving modern economic logic regarding managing property and resources is enclosure, where property rights include not only use, but exclusion of others' access to that property and the right to alter or to destroy the property. Remember our bundle of sticks. This particular rights bundle, especially with regards to alteration and destruction, comes to us from ancient Rome. Yet other resource management strategies have been active before and since, including robust management of commons, which are communally owned land and resources. More than 1,000 years ago, rice farmers in Bali created a ritual-based farming system in which subaks, self-governing organizations of farmers, managed the shared use of irrigation water among groups of terraced rice paddies. Subaks met in religious temples that were built along irrigation channels to coordinate planting and watering schedules and to avoid the water shortages that would occur if everyone planted at once. Many such temples and terraces together formed large irrigation networks. Water scheduling also controlled rice pests by creating synchronized harvests that deprived pests, such as rats and grasshoppers, of their food and habitat. The hundreds of water temples were sites of festivals, rituals, and religious offerings, and scheduling meetings were embedded in this ritual context. Bali's water temple system was upended in the 1970s when the Asian Development Bank implemented a program to increase rice harvest to feed more people, calling for the replacement of native rice with modified varieties that required use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Farmers in Bali were pushed to plant as frequently as possible and to abandon their water temple scheduling rituals. The consequences were perhaps predictable. Rice output initially increased, but then the elimination of coordinated scheduling created other problems, such as increased crop damage due to pests, soil damage, and water scarcity. After what came to be known as the Time of Hunger, the Balinese reinstated their traditional temple system of planting and harvesting scheduling and irrigation, and this system is still in effect today. From the Middle Ages in England, nobles had ownership of land. For example, the Duke of Sussex owned the county of Sussex, but peasants had use rights to that land, meaning they could use it for farming, grazing, hunting, and foraging. The open field system developed, where land adjoining villages was used by communities who would alternately farm the fields, each family to a strip, and leave the fields fallow and used for grazing, in a repeating annual cycle. In the centuries following the Middle Ages, landowners gradually enclosed the previously available land for private activities, mainly grazing of personal sheep herds. This process of enclosure led to the disappearance of hundreds of villages and local agricultural practices, and manifested the private land and resources logic we have today. Garrett Hardin, in 1968's Tragedy of the Commons, wrote that common property systems allow individuals to benefit at a cost to the community, and therefore are inherently prone to exhaustion and collapse. In Hardin's view, any rational herdsman would take advantage of community property, and this rational incentive for free riding results in an inevitable tragedy where, in the words of Hardin, each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit. In a world that is limited, ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. According to Hardin, private property with robust inheritance rights was the only solution to avoid such tragedy. The Tragedy of the Commons describes a prisoner's dilemma game in which everyone chooses to defect. In the prisoner's dilemma, imagine that two bank robbers have been caught, but the police can't charge them for the full crime unless one or both of the prisoners confess, implicating the other as well. If only one prisoner confesses, known as defecting, then the confessing prisoner gets 1 year time and the other 10. If both prisoners defect, they both get 7 years. And if neither prisoner defects, called cooperating, they both get 3 years. The payoff matrix looks something like this. So A can cooperate or A can defect, B can cooperate and B can defect. Payoffs are written as A's payoff and then B's payoff. So the payoff for both cooperating is 3-3. For one cooperating and the other defecting is 10-1 or 1-10. And for both defecting, the payoff is 7-7. To find a Nash equilibrium, look along each column and choose the best payoff. These are player A's choices. Then do the same for rows. These are player B's choices. Look for the strategy with a coincidence of choices. We see that this game has a single Nash equilibrium, which is for each player to defect. Defecting is the best strategy for either, regardless of what the other player does. A single instance of this game is a one-off, but most real-life instances of Prisoner's Dilemma's dynamics are played as repeated games amongst a group of players. This sequential layering of games produces different results from a single game, where the best strategy for repeated Prisoner Dilemma games is tit for tat, where players initially cooperate, and if a player defects, the other players will defect for a period of time before returning to cooperation. There's another set of games known as coordination games, where the payoffs are better for coordinating than not. The first is the car crash game, where two cars are in an imminent head-on collision and they both need to swerve. If each swerves left or right, the collision is avoided, otherwise they crash. Here's a payoff matrix. If they both swerve left, they don't crash and they get a payoff of 8. Otherwise, if one goes left and one goes right, they will hit each other, and so the payoff is 0. Should be negative. And again, if they both swerve right, the payoff is 8. Now we look for the Nashes. We see now that there are two Nash equilibria, provided they both swerve in the same direction. These equilibria are also Pareto efficient in that they both provide the best payoff to both players. Another famous coordination game, identified by both Jean-Jacques Rousseau and David Hume, is called the stag hunt game. Two hunters need to coordinate to catch a stag, or they could hunt individually for a hare. A stag is worth more than a hare, but if one hunter hunts for a stag while the other hunts for a hare, then the hare hunter gets his hare and the stag hunter gets nothing. Here's the payoff matrix. Let's say they both hunt a stag, they get a payoff of 5. If one hunts a stag and the other the hare, the person who hunts for the hare gets a 2, the person who hunts alone for the stag gets a 0, and vice versa. And if they both hunt hares, they both catch their hares, but they get a payoff of 2. Again, we see 2 Nash equilibria, but these aren't Pareto efficient because one equilibria provides a better payoff than the other. It's also common to think of the stag game as being about risk and trust. If one hunter doesn't trust the other, the less risky option is to just go bag a hare. Coordination games are sometimes called assurance games since they depend on trust, or rules and norms. This brings us to Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel in 2009 for her analysis of economic governance, especially the commons, though she shared her Nobel with Oliver Williamson of transaction cost economics. Her 8 principles for managing a commons are suggestions for building institutions such that such games resolve more often at the highest payoffs. In her Governing the Commons in 1990, she identified common design elements observed in sustainable common management arrangements. These are 1. Clearly defined boundaries. Individuals or households who have rights to withdraw resource units from the commons must be clearly defined, as must the boundaries of the commons itself. The second, congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. Match rules governing the use of commons goods to local needs and conditions. Appropriation rules restricting time, place, technology, and/or quantity of resource units are related to local conditions and to provision rules requiring labor, material, and/or money. The third, collective choice arrangements. Ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. 4. Develop a system carried out by community members for monitoring members' behavior. Monitors who actively audit commons conditions and appropriator behavior are accountable to the appropriators or are the appropriators themselves. 5. Use graduated sanctions for rule violators. Appropriators who violate operational rules are likely to be assessed graduated sanctions, depending on the seriousness and context of the offense, by other appropriators, by officials accountable to those appropriators, or by both. 6. Provide accessible, low-cost means for conflict resolution. Appropriators and their officials have rapid access to low-cost local arenas to resolve conflicts among appropriators or between appropriators and officials. 7. Make sure the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. The rights of appropriators to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities. And finally, 8. Build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. I'm going to conclude this segment with some comments about Ostrom's last principle. Principle 8 has a great deal in common with the principle of subsidiarity, which describes a social organization that holds that social and political issues should be dealt with at the most immediate or local level that is consistent with their resolution. This principle of subsidiarity has its roots in the work of Thomas Aquinas and is an element of Catholic social teaching, but it was made famous by Alexis de Tocqueville's 1935 Democracy in America, in which de Tocqueville describes the high degree to which the citizens of the early United States adhered to this nested tier of governance. According to de Tocqueville, this centralization has not only an administrative value, but also a civic dimension, since it increases the opportunities for citizens to take interest in public affairs. More recently, the United Nations Development Program, in its 1999 report, included the statement that decentralization or decentralizing governance refers to the restructuring or reorganization of authority so that there is a system of co-responsibility between institutions of governance at the central, regional, and local levels according to the principle of subsidiarity, thus increasing the overall quality and effectiveness of the system of governance while increasing the authority and capacities of subnational levels. Aside from the civic engagement and informational efficiencies expected from subsidiarity arrangements, subsidiarity allows for self-organization and emergence of novel governance structures. Balinese water temples are cited as exemplars of the bottom-up social organization indicative of complex systems. Steve Lansing, who studies these temple networks extensively, describes them as complex adaptive systems that have evolved to manage agroecosystems. Jane Jacobs' growth dynamics we saw also require the subsidiarity principle in work organization. Thus, we see evidence that subsidiarity structures permit the manifestation of the inherent nature of complex systems to evolve and self-organize.